Hello to all participants and attendees, and thank you very much for joining us today from different parts of the globe for our online activities in the framework of the project GLAM and Digital Soft Power in the Post-Pandemic Reality. For all those who join us the first time, let me take a few minutes to introduce the project to your attention and share with you our agenda for today. The research project brings together academics, policymakers, and GLAM professionals to explore innovative ways to advance, activate, and communicate the value of cultural assets and heritage collections in the global media environment to develop meaningful digital cultural relations with audiences and communities around the world. The project also aims to employ the power of data, machine learning, and artificial intelligence to develop new methodologies and tools for GLAM institutions to better understand, assess, and demonstrate their impacts in different countries, as well as to provide an inductive research platform for strategic development and growth. I'm very happy to invite you to our first Datathon from collection APIs to geo-visualization. The event will offer a discussion space to play with and assess the first layer of the soft power prototype that aims to geo-visualize museum collections data to explore their potential reach and appeal in different countries around the world. We designed it by aggregating API data from Victoria and Albert Museum and the National Museum of Australia. The webinar will include three important activities. First of all, demo presentation of the new prototype first layer, then interactive evaluation panel, and a discussion forum, each taking no longer than 30-40 minutes. We will open this session with an introduction of our co-host, Professor Lev Manovich, and Director of the Cultural Analytics Lab. And we will close the session by discussing contribution from all our attendees that we will collect via Mentimeter after the demo. I also wanted to invite you all to use the Q&A function to submit all the questions that you have to our panelists and to our participants, and we will use the discussion forum time and space to address all these questions. Let me now share the floor with our co-host, Lev Manovich. He is a leading theorist of digital culture and a pioneer in using big data to study visual culture. He's the author and editor of 14 books, including Culture Analytics, Artificial Intelligence Aesthetics, and Theories of Software Culture, among many others. Lev is a presidential professor at the Graduate Center at the City University of New York and the director of the Cultural Analytics Lab. The lab created projects from the Museum of Modern Art, New York Public Library, and other GLAM institutions in different countries. Cultural Analytics Lab uses data science methods to analyze contemporary global culture while critically interrogating these methods from the perspectives of humanities and media theory. So Lev, you're very welcome to take the floor right now.
Okay, thank you so much, Natalia, for invitation and for generous introduction. I do believe that the work you're doing is very interesting and very unique, and especially this week or this month, we're thinking a lot about diplomacy, since obviously the second Cold War, right, is going full speed, and we're moving towards a moment which I hope will not be as dramatic as the Cuban Missile Crisis, but you never know. So diplomacy is perhaps our only hope. So cultural diplomacy may not stop a war, but it can give us lots of pleasure, enjoyment, and bring to more people the best of humanity, which is culture. So I will share my screen, and I promise Natalia to keep my remarks to 10 minutes since she's my main event today. So what I want to do briefly is just to give you a sense of the kind of projects I've been doing in my lab. The lab was established in 2007 to explore the use of data visualization, machine learning, data science, in combination with humanities and media studies method as a way to map both contemporary culture and historical culture. And in particular, we wanted to experiment with new ways to visualize cultural collections. In fact, while I was searching for slides to show, right, in my keynote folder, I came across my presentation from exactly 10 years ago, right? So that was probably the first panel at the College Art Association, where we talked about information visualization as a research method in art history. And looking for this, I realized that like the key projects of my lab were already done by the time. So just a few things. And I'm not sharing screen on purpose, just to make sure like I control things. So after having done about 43 projects with different museums, MOM, and so on, I tried to systematize what I learned about working with cultural collections and big data. So in the fall of 2020, MIT Press published my book, right? So it's a kind of textbook. And the audience, which I mentioned, the ideal audience is exactly people like curators and working in museums who want to think about how a data-centric approach can give them interesting new ways to interact with a collection, to analyze it, to interpret it, to present it to viewers. And I was inspired in this particular approach, which we pursued in the lab, by the fact that my lab was located inside the California Institute for Telecommunication and Information, SCALA-Q2, where I was working with other labs which were developing these kind of visual supercomputers. So what you see here is not a big painting. It's a kind of visual supercomputer made from 70 30-inch monitors. And working with the labs inside this institute, by 2009, we developed unique software where you can load thousands of images on this interactive wall, and then you can sort them and do other manipulations to find patterns, something a bit similar to what Cleveland Gallery 1 has implemented in 2013. And I thought that by today, this seems to be everywhere, but instead we're also looking at our small screen spaces. So just a few things. Okay, so let me start maybe here. So this, I'm not necessarily showing most relevant projects to today's session. I'm kind of showing projects which I think are easy to explain in a few minutes. So, so this one was a visualization of all the covers of Time magazine, which we downloaded from their site in 2009. So magazine started to be published in 1923. So here we have 86 years of cultural history, and it's particularly nice to work with sequential narratives such as comic books, manga, or all the covers of magazine, because they come out at regular intervals and we have the same, right? In contrast to artists, all the covers are painted, so to speak, at the same size. So what we've simply done is using, you can do it in Photoshop, but I wrote software to do it, is we created this grid where all the covers are organized in time, kind of left to right, top to bottom. And when I describe this visualization, I found about 14 different patterns which have to do with changes in color, saturation, contrast, composition, but also content. And again, I'm sorry to say I've heard this about a million times from me. So this is the beginning, 1920s, right? Of course, mostly covers show men, very important people, very general politicians and so on. But color comes in, but very slowly, because color was very expensive. So it takes about 20 years to transition to color. And then this is we're zooming in into 1940s. So here we switched from doing photography to kind of doing painting. And we can see how very visual style, right, where color palette became very uniform during this period. And then this is the jumping to, I think, 1960s, when in many countries, including Japan, for example, and also US, journalism becomes more varied in terms of topics it's covering. And now we see a certain proportion of covers, which also show you different subjects and not simply illustrations, not simply people. So why do I believe that this approach, which I call media visualization, is important? Because today, one of the key interfaces we have to museum collections is still search. The problem with search, you kind of have to know what to search for. And also when you search, you get discrete images, right, which fit your search criteria, you get numbers. So this ability to look at the collection as a whole, by which I don't mean like the whole collection metropolitan, but collection which is thematic or historical, all the 19th century paintings, for example, all the prints over time, is that you can see gradually changing patterns, right, which is harder to see if you only rely on looking at the separate images or looking at search. And then this is the same data, right? But here using some very elementary functions from computer vision, where we measured average saturation of each cover. So saturation describes the intensity of color. So covers which are mostly black and white are at the bottom, and covers which have a very kind of intense color are mostly in the top. And the point is not to featureize this particular approach. I mean, we develop software where you can quickly go for dozens of these different features, right? And sort your collection by time by these features. And what was interesting is to see this almost like sine wave, right? Sine wave, like wave-like movements where things become more saturated, when less, when there is a big jump, right, in 1960s. And also we see that variability, right, which is the range from top to bottom cover is larger. Even 1970s, the period of economic, right, crisis, with certain also decrease in variability. And then, you can see also how it's difficult to predict future, because instead of going up, things go down, because at the end of this period, we have lots of white, we have this kind of minimalism, right, coming in, and things change. So finally, I'll just show you one last thing as an example of this approach, which is not going to be this visualization, which shows you 1 million manga pages, because I think no museum has such collections. So I'll show you something more smaller scale, which is 40% of all paintings and pastels painted by French Impressionists. It has been estimated that these participants, right, of Impressionist exhibitions in Paris, together during a lifetime, have painted approximately 13,000 paintings and pastels. Only about 1% of these images is repeatedly reproduced in art books on websites. So, like all of cultural history, we only know the tips of icebergs. So we try to collect as many images as we can. So we're able to collect about 40,000. So it's about 5,000 images, right? And then using the technique, which is now more common, but was not used much at the time, which is 2010, called principal component analysis. The computer actually measures about 400 different characteristics from each image, and then automatically try to organize them in two-dimensional space in such a way with images which are visually similar are close to each other. And it's hard to see here. So the images are not simply sorted by color, by brightness, but you kind of have different clusters of style, different clusters of visual parameters next to each other. And I'm zooming in, right? I mean, all these things are interactive. All these visualizations are anywhere between 10 and 30,000 pixels. So in fact, it would look great. Like, right, you can project it on the whole wall of a museum, etc. You can make it interactive. But this is just a static thing to make it easy for you, right? So this is the typical Impressionist paintings they're famous for, right? So the new city, the new images of city life, trains, cafes, luminous, the new subject, shopping, very light. But if you look at everything we've done, you realize that what we're famous for is maybe only about 30%. And we painted also lots of images which are yellow, brown, and so on. So some are images which we painted when we were studying, some images which are painted later. And this is the second thing, and I'm finishing in a second. So I kept my promise. So the idea is to try to visualize as much as possible, and ideally everything. So what I mean by everything, let's look at all the paintings of Van Gogh, right? Let's look at all the paintings of Picasso together. Let's look at all the paintings of Impressionism. And then by sorting them, right? By sorting them, aggregating them, measuring them in different ways, let's see the patterns, such as slow gradual changes in this case, or simply try to understand, for example, if we select the most famous works, and we select them into these visualizations, what about the rest, right? So what is the relation, for example, between Impressionism as it exists in our history books, right? On the websites, in Wikipedia, which is a very small tip of the iceberg, and everything else we have done. So I'm finishing, but I hope I was able to illustrate just a few advantages, right, of using these kind of visual methods to represent collections. The idea is not simply to see the invisible, but to enrich our understanding of cultural history, of art history, of contemporary historical art, and to basically help us see differently, which is, of course, what modern artists have always tried to do themselves. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Lev. Your work is such an inspiration. It was such an inspiration for my own research developments. And I know that many people today came just to see you and connect to you. And thank you so much for taking your time to come and to do this introductory.
Thank you so much for my 12. Thank you so much for 12 minutes. I think people sometimes like my talk. We don't understand what I'm saying because I'm talking too fast, but we see that I'm very excited. So I just wanted to share my excitement to kind of open for Natalia. Please go ahead. So thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Yes, and this excitement is, and your energy is with us. Thank you for sharing that. So before I introduce you to the new demo prototype, let me step back a little bit and provide a very brief background of the project, especially for people who are not very familiar with it. In the beginning of 2018, I received an engagement research grant from the University of Melbourne to collaborate with the Australian Centre for the Moving Image to develop a pilot dynamic verb application, Museum Soft Power Map. This digital system offered a new computational research method to explore contemporary museums and geography of their influence. It mapped Australian Centre of the Moving Image, or ACMI, attraction power in Melbourne and abroad through a multi-layered exploration of ACMI cultural resources and social outputs to reveal social, demographic, cultural, and economic factors that affect its capacity to attract larger visitation and revenue in different parts of the world. The application offered engaging way to explore ACMI multilingual and multicultural film collection and its potential appeal in different countries around the world. It also mapped ACMI online global audiences across its website, social media pages such as Facebook, and 2 dedicated YouTube channels, as well as TripAdvisor. It also geo-visualized ACMI international network of institutional connections and partnerships, and also ACMI local audiences and their linguistic, cultural, and social diversity. It also helped to map local impact of ACMI blockbusters such as DreamWorks Animation and Game Masters touring around the world, which went to 16 different cities in different continents. And finally, we developed a new forecast layer in 2019 that predicted the potential impact of ACMI's the most recent touring exhibition, which is called Wonderland, in 17 different cities across continents. While the project received multiple professional and academic awards and great interest, along with a favorable feedback from the global community of museum professionals and scholars, it also revealed significant limitations in terms of implementation challenges and its very narrow focus on a single museum. Addressing these limitations, we embarked on the new research journey to advance the pilot and develop a new mapping prototype employing new approaches. Specifically, in the development of the new prototype, we aim to move forward from labor-intensive research to an automated solution by adding more dynamic data mining and aggregation, as well as by tapping into open access data. We also want to advance from a single museum app to an online service for museums by developing a dynamic mapping software for universal use across museums. We want to enhance the pilot with a timeline that would allow to track the soft power reach and strength in different geolocations in different time periods. And finally, we would like to advance the visualization software by employing machine learning to analyze patterns of cultural engagement to predict soft power. The new prototype that we are currently developing will have only 3 layers, and we will focus on 3 key tasks, such as mapping digital collections, mapping digital audiences, and mapping traveling programs exhibitions. Also, the new software will offer an interface for setting up a data to power individual profile for each museum by sharing links to its key resources and data repositories. Today, I'm happy to share with you the first mapping layer, which is called Collection Reach Power. It provides a dialogical platform to automatically aggregate museums' API's data from museum collections' digital catalogs to map a potential collection reach and appeal to audiences living in different countries. Correlating collections' geographic diversity data with digital physical audiences' mobility insights, the layer exposes areas on the global map where collection items and artifacts might have a greater reach and potentially appeal to local audiences. Before I show you the demo, let's start with the mapping framework. The first layer calculates a collection reach power index for each of the country on the global map, indicating where the collection could make a greater reach and appeal. This index is a weighted sum of several key normalized indicators based on three key types of data: institutional data, social media data, and open access data of different social demographic variables for each country. The scale from 0 to 100 for each of these indices should be interpreted in a linear fashion, not logarithmically. And for the collection reach power layer, the score allows us to compare different countries in terms of the scope of their collection's reach and the appeal to people living in this particular geographic area. So institutional data on the collection of the collection diversity is one of the most important variables in calculating the global reach power index. Museum artifacts and collections have always remained a strong source of cultural and political power to shape culture and political discourses, build citizenry and sense of national identity and belonging, and construct public perceptions and understanding of reality. Furthermore, the material cultural heritage makes museums powerful institutions that drive local tourism, offer platforms for historic, cultural, and scientific research. And as the former director of the Metropolitan Museum stressed, it is the collection that defines the museum. The better and more diverse the collection is, the better the museum is, and the better it is for all of us. A geographic diversity of museum collections is a very important variable that makes museum influential actor on the world stage. Objects from the collections offer important avenues that connect museums to cultural communities of their origin. They become important assets in cultivating international cultural relations through loans, repatriation activities, exchange projects, educational and archival programs, co-curated exhibitions, and even cultural and political missions organized on very high diplomatic levels. Geo-visualization of collections' origins and histories is necessary to highlight the area on the world map where this power could be exercised or generated. Mapping collections' geodiversity brings to light important details about museum audiences and stakeholders and tell important stories about museum histories. In our prototype, institutional data on the collection diversity is automatically aggregated via Museum Collections API. Specifically, we developed an interface that allows the system to access the collections API via a provided link, search the collection for the geolocation information for each object, and extract this particular data and automatically distribute the data across all countries on the globe. In this way, each country receives its unique index of the collection diversity, which basically shows how many holdings in the museum collection originates from this particular country. While Collections API provided a quick and efficient way to search the collection for required geolocation data, there are currently several types of limitations that we faced. First of all, institutional challenges that basically refer to the existence and quality of Collections API. Not all museums have developed and made their metadata open for their public access. This is first. Second, among those with Collections API, there are not so many who provided complete data about their objects. In some museums, we found the Collections API quite limited in terms of data categories presented, and specifically lacking focused data on geolocation of objects. In some cases, we were able to identify geolocation data, but less than 50% of the objects were not properly annotated in this category. Finally, Collections API do not cover the data of all objects which constitute museum collections. So let me now move forward to talk about another very important variable. Social media data contribute to the calculation of the digital diversity index for each country. And this index shows how the country is represented by a museum in its feeds on different social media channels. It's about the number of references made to each country on the globe on social media communication across different global channels like YouTube, Twitter, or Facebook. The rationale for quantifying these references on social media stems from the soft power convergence model and its cause-effect continuum. This continuum represents a conversion process from resources to behavioral outcomes in an agent-subject relationship. As Joseph Nye clarifies, agents need to convert their resources to achieve desired outcomes from their targeted subjects. The basic elements in power conversion process include resources, conversion strategies, behaviors or targeted response, and finally outcomes. In this way, the process of generating soft power starts with activating available resources through employing certain strategies that lead to certain outputs, eventually shaping complex networks of relationship between agents and subjects. Social media, that usually has a very marketing and promotional character in this sense, is a perfect indicator that shows that there are specific activities or initiatives from the museum that relates to different countries and their context. The data for the Digital Diversity Index is automatically aggregated by Social Media API, which allows to make dynamic queries to the social media content of posts made by this museum or organization in various global media channels. Social Media API that allows to quickly scan the content produced by the museum in their feeds is a fantastic way to explore the extent to which country is referenced by a museum on its social media. However, there are certain limitations that we faced again, because only YouTube as a channel allowed us to mine all texts generated by the museum around their videos in their own posts. Other social media channels pose some barriers in these tasks. For example, Twitter allows to scan only 2,250 most recent tweets from the organization's feed at a time. And Facebook, along with Instagram, require academics and researchers to go through a rigorous application process in order to get an access to the API data. While we have applied to Facebook to resolve our right, still it takes a while, and Facebook still has this power to either offer or deny the access to the API data on the merit of their application quality and its targeted audiences, as well as the extent to which the personal data on users can be aggregated and used in commercial purposes. We are waiting for some updates in this process, and in terms of the other channels, I actually wanted to direct this question back to our audiences and to all of you and ask what other social media channels are important for museums at the moment, and which other channels we could add to calculate the Digital Diversity Index. So finally, the collection Rich Power Index includes open access data of various social demographic variables that point to what extent audiences in each geolocation are able to interact with digital museums and their collections. This set of data draws on the framework of 3 levels of digital inequalities provided by British scholars in 2019. The first level points to issues of access to technologies such as hardware, software, and the internet. The second level refers to digital literacy, or the knowledge gap and digital skills related to the medium and the task at hand. Finally, digital cultural participation is the third level of inequality that emerges from the other 2 levels, which define who and how interacts with digital cultural content. As an example, I wanted to share with you this very interesting figure that offers an analysis of 3 data sets over time, including internet access, the use of digital museum sites, and actual museum visits. The data was compiled for a decade from 2005 until 2016 from the UK context, and the correlation of data revealed a stable growth in levels of household internet access and visits to the museums and galleries, as well as access to their websites through the covered period. What is the most interesting, however, is that actual museum visits and website use evolve almost in parallel, confirming that digital media do indeed play a growing role in audience engagement with museums online and on site. I adopted this framework to explore the potential digital receptive power of each country to engage with online museums and their collections, and included the following important variables. The potential audience scope, which includes population index based on the targeted total population number taken only for certain age groups from 10 to 55 years old, and literacy index that refers to the data indicating the educational level and digital literacy rate. Digital mobility index, it refers to the first level of inequality and offers insights into the internet penetration rate and mobile usage index. I also included such variables as physical mobility of the population and the country global exposure, which I believe are quite useful in assessing the third level of digital inequalities, which refer to the level of cultural engagement and participation. Physical mobility is the annual tourist departures, showing indirectly the population number that belongs to this kind of middle or upper middle social class, who have a greater exposure potentials to different countries, even if it is happening through mere touristic experiences. And the global exposure index combines three sets of data, such as tourist arrivals, migrants, and language diversity, indicating how diverse and global the cultural environment of the country, pointing to a potential level of audiences' cultural awareness and reception to engage with content from different countries, which actually goes beyond their national or regional comfort zone. These various social demographic variables data were aggregated from the open access data API of the World Bank, collected for the latest period of currently existing data sets ending in 2018 and 2019. Yes, these statistics for the period before the pandemic hit us. This open access data API provided a very convenient and quick way to dynamically aggregate large amount of data to correlate with institutional and social media data sets, and they easily could be updated once the World Bank publishes new statistics. However, again, there are several limitations that are important to be acknowledged. And first of all, we rely here on externally collected, aggregated, and analyzed data collected by a third party. And it is important to understand the limitations and biases that stem from their own methodologies and data provenance. Second, currently the consistent and accurate social demographic data for different geolocations on the globe exist only on the national or the country level. However, some countries can be really diverse, and what applies to certain regions or urban areas might not be necessarily true in some other parts. For example, when we worked on the pilot project with ACMI, we were very quickly realized that Taiwan and Hong Kong, that are officially a part of China, has completely different levels of digital engagements on three levels of digital inequalities, especially in comparison to China. Let me now show you the interface of the data to power profile setting and the results of mapping of two collections APIs, such as the National Museum of Australia and Victoria and Albert Museum. So first of all, this is how the interface looks like. And we go to the data to power profile again. And for the purpose of demonstration, I just use any kind of demo, not a real museum. So this is how it looks like. And as I explained previously, we have different entry points here. The first very important entry point is collections API, which allows us to scan very quickly the collection API and extract all the data that we need on the object's geolocations that we then apply to our mapping. So we click here, we provide the correct link, and we press continue here. I will not do it, however, today, because it will take a while. So for depending on how many, for example, the last time I processed the data of National Museum of Australia, as you can see here, and it processed more than 50,000 items in the collections. So yeah, and it takes a while. So, and we don't have this time to wait. And the same goes for their different social media collections API. In the YouTube channels API, we just find out the channel ID and put it here. And for the Twitter API, we just need to, to put the name, and it will be able to find this. For example, if you go this, and this is National Museum of Australia, and it finds us the National Museum of Australia and its description. And if we press continue, it will start, scanning all the tweets collected by the national, posted by the National Museum of Australia in its feed. So this is how it looks like. It's pretty easy to use. And once you are done with all these entry points, you just go back to your profile. You can edit your profile by, correcting the name and choosing the file for your institutional image if you want. And then you open visualization. You just press the button here, and it will direct you to the dynamic web application that shows how your data was visualized on the global map. So let me start with the Victoria and Albert Museum. This is a collection Reach Power. As I said, we will have 3 layers in our prototype, and the first layer is ready. The other 2 are disabled still, so they will come later. And the collection Reach Power uses color coding to indicate the countries with the maximum collection reach power, which is indicated with the color yellow. And their intensity of the blue actually refers to the areas on the global map where the collection would not have that much great reach and appeal. So, for example, one of the countries that really interested me was Japan. And because the collection reach power is 100. So if we look at different variables that gives us such a strong index of its reach power, we will be able, first of all, to see that there are a lot of artifacts in the collections that originally stem from Japan. What is really more interesting and exciting is that the digital diversity or representation of this object or representation of these countries in social media feeds of Victoria and Albert museums, especially on YouTube and Twitter, is also very, very strong. So, and I would ask Kati maybe to elaborate later on that and like, why is it happening that way? So, and in terms of the potential audience scope, it's pretty high, basically because of their literacy and digital literacy level of the population. The digital mobility of the population is also very high because of the mobile and internet access. But even though the global exposure is not that high and physical mobility is very low, it still gives this very, very kind of strong, calculates a very strong reach power for Victoria and Albert Museum for Japan. So let me now go to the data to power profile of National Museum of Australia and do the same. So this is the collection reach power with yellow indicating the most powerful zones and blue indicating those areas where a collection would have lower reach. And for example, let me, for example, go to this time to this part of the world and go, for example, to Canada, right? The Canada, which is colored green, meaning that their potential reach of the collection is somewhere in the middle. And why do we have this here? First of all, we can see on the collection diversity that there are only a few objects that come from Canada. And more importantly, none of them have been recently represented on a social media. Canada was not mentioned in their feed so far. In terms of their potential audience scope, Canada is somewhere in the middle, again, not because of the population, targeted population index, but mostly because of the literacy rate. And also what is really cool about this part is the digital mobility is very, very strong, also with the physical mobility and the global exposure. Of course, Canada is such a multilingual and multicultural country. So yeah, this is basically it. It's kind of, let me now go back to my slides. So let me now open the evaluation further and invite all audiences to answer a few questions via Mentimeter. I'm sharing the link to the Mentimeter poll right now, so you can respond to a few questions when you have a free minute in the rest of the time during the event. We will come back to discuss the results at the very end of our datathon. And to submit your answer, please go to the menti.com and use the code 48891330. So I will also post this information in the chat for your convenience. You can also access the poll via QR code that you can see on the screen. So thank you for your attention, and I would like to invite to the floor right now our interactive evaluation panel participants who will share their critical feedback from the institutional, professional, and academic perspectives. And I hope this conversation will create a space to reflect on the proposed solution design, usability, drawbacks, and implications for museum collection management practices. And today on the panel, we have Kati Price, the head of digital media at Victoria and Albert Museum, Craig Middleton, Senior Curator of Digital Innovation and Strategy at the National Museum of Australia, Jolan Wuyts, Collection Editor at Europeana and API Specialist, and of course, Lev Manovich. I would love to hear from him as well. The panel will be facilitated by Professor Corneliu Bjola, who is a professor of diplomatic studies and the head of the Digital Diplomacy Research Group at the University of Oxford. Corneliu also is the partner in this research project. So Corneliu, the floor is yours right now. Please invite everybody to the panel.
Well, thank you very much, Natalia. Great presentation, and I'm sure we're going to have plenty of feedback to your discussion. Now, moving into the evaluation panel, I like to invite our guest, Craig Middleton. Is a senior curator, digital innovation and strategy at the National Museum of Australia. He has been involved in developing a number of digital innovation projects. The same Jonathan Wuyts, it's a digital humanist working in the European collection engagement. It focuses on project management, a number of projects dealing with cultural heritage. And of course, Kati Price heads digital media and publishing at the Victoria Albert Museum, and she is involved running, coordinating a team that works in technology, design, and content. And she is responsible for the brand and user experience of the Victoria Albert Museum digital estate and exhibitions. So what I think would be interesting in this context is to, especially because we've been working on on projects that deal with cultural engagement and cultural outreach, just to try to understand from your perspectives, how do you think about the prototype that Natalia has just presented in terms of opportunities and challenges that could be applied in your own work, and probably drawing on your own experience, what kind of additional insight could you offer to enhance the value in terms of cultural engagement of the model presented by Natalia. So I think each presenter we're going to have about 5 minutes to make their remarks, and we'll take it from there. So let me start with Kati. Are you I'm just trying to.
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah. Katie, you have the floor. 5 minutes.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Corneliu, and great presentation, Natalia. Thank you. I think first off, it's always interesting to see examples of how people use our collections data and our API. And it really demonstrates how important it is to think about opening up our data when we're thinking about how we provide global access to our collections and knowledge. It's such a fundamentally important tool at our disposal in creating that access. I think it tells us some interesting top level views on the history of our collections, our collecting policy, and of how those collections are received by our audiences. And I think it's that latter part that I'm particularly interested in as somebody who leads our digital activity. As Natalia mentioned in the presentation, you can see that Japan is really indexing high in terms of its reach and power, which demonstrates a number of things. As she said, it shows that we have many collections that originate from Japan and Japanese culture and heritage. But it also shows in terms of our digital diversity that Japan and Japanese culture is getting lots of mentions in our social media. As I pointed out to her, that's really reflecting the fact that we've recently had an exhibition called Kimono Kyoto to Catwalk, which is an exhibition that covered the whole history of the kimono and its influence on contemporary culture. And we featured lots of objects from our collection as part of the digital outreach during that time. And it fueled lots of our social media engagement, and we created a series of YouTube videos that have proved to be really popular, not just during the course of the exhibition, but have become evergreen content that remains really popular on YouTube. So I think it's interesting in terms of decision making and what this tool might offer us, because reading this visualization, we might then start making decisions to prioritize Japan and Japanese heritage to feature in our programming. But I guess my question is, do we then inadvertently create a filter bubble where instead of looking at underserved audiences or underappreciated or underrecognized areas of our collections, do we then focus on prioritizing the most popular collections and content and keep that bubbling to the top? So I think there's an interesting question there about how one mediates some of the biases of the data and perhaps deliberately focuses on some of the areas that are under indexing, for example. I think there's also, as you explored, Natalia, in your presentation, around some of the limitations of social media, not all having open APIs. And, for example, Twitter and YouTube having very particular and distinct audiences, and to what extent we are going to sway or steer our digital activity around particular behaviors and interactions on Twitter. There's a lot of questions that raises. Also sort of gaps in the data around, for example, Chinese audiences and Chinese social media engagement. And that's where I think supplementing this sort of data with other types of data like Google Analytics can prove really interesting. And when you're digging into things like Google Analytics data, you can see, for example, that Chinese audiences are very interested in the V&A's collections that relate to Chinese cultural heritage, but they're also very interested in 20th century European fashion and in the work of the Victorian designer William Morris. And in fact, Chinese audiences are in that respect very similar to UK or French audiences. So I think this sort of relationship between audiences from a particular geographic area and the cultural heritage of that area, and whether it's there's the opportunity, in fact, a duty to open up the collections much more broadly and ensure that we are connecting people with objects and collections and stories of those collections that span wide geographical areas. I also think the challenge of social is that it doesn't necessarily say anything about the quality of that engagement. And I think the idea of sentiment and how one might layer that into such a data visualization could be really interesting, because we're not necessarily seeing how that content, those collection stories are landing with the audience. It's more about reach and volume rather than quality of engagement. And I think adding additional sort of engagement metrics into him could be quite interesting. I think ultimately, it's great to see these two examples and to see the previous work with ACMI. As an institution, we've got 17 national collections. We've got over 2 million objects and archival items in our care. I wonder if and how such a breadth and variety to our holdings could actually swerve the data. So it'd be interesting to see how we compare to other organizations, both of a similar size, but also institutions with much smaller collections, and how that changes the sort of data visualization in a sort of more comparative way. So I think this idea of being able to compare with other collections could be really interesting. But ultimately, I think any tool that encourages us to think about the diversity of our collections and reflecting that diversity in our programming and our digital activity and global outreach is a very positive thing. So thank you for allowing me 5 minutes and to engage in the discussion. I look forward to engaging in more of that discussion with colleagues and other participants in this session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Katie. And I think we'll get back to you soon, for additional comments. But let me move now to Craig. So Craig, I've been wondering from your perspective, especially since Melbourne was the first museum to be included in this prototype. What's your view about how this cultural engagement performance, in a sense, it's going, and whether you have additional insight of how the tool could be used?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for inviting me. Before I get started, I just wanted to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you today from the lands of the Ngunnawal, Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples, the traditional custodians of the land that is now known as Canberra. And I wanted to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and to any First Nations person listening in, watching in today. Before I jump into some of the insights that I feel are important to mention, I just wanted to give a bit of context on the National Museum of Australia's API, because context is everything. And so our API is made up of only 85,000 object records, and that's inclusive of about 20,000 images. And so this is only part, obviously, of an entire collection, but our collection is also much, much smaller than the Victoria and Albert's collection, for example, with an estimated number of 210,000 objects in the collection. So the other piece of context for this API is that we took the approach of releasing records of objects that were either already in the public domain or were able to be used under a Creative Commons license, which again nods to the limitations of the data within that data set. Now, just with my brief engagement with this tool, I have found it really interesting, and I guess what I was looking for was some of the expected insights and some of the unexpected insights. So I won't dwell on the expected, but one that's super obvious is that the UK has lit up in bright yellow, which makes a lot of sense for the National Museum of Australia, because Australia's colonial history is inextricably tied to the UK. And so a lot of our collections do relate to those links between Australia and the UK. And I could go into that, but I won't. I just wanted to touch on two unexpected things that I found unexpected, but I've dug down and found a few reasons for those unexpected insights. The first was that Guinea, an small African nation, was highlighted quite brightly as well. And I was really curious about that, because I don't believe the National Museum, my understanding of our collection is that we don't have a strong African representation. And I did find out just by moving through that data set and the visualization that actually the data has nothing to do with the African nation of Guinea. It's actually got to do with Papua New Guinea, which is a small island nation north of Australia, one of our closest neighbours, and a nation that was governed by Australia between 1902 and 1975. So the links there within our collection and within the collection API, as I dug through it, were really strong. And I can give you a few examples of that. We have a collection called the Lady Helen Blackburn collection, which features about 500 seashells collected from Australian beaches, reefs and islands. And many of these shells were collected on the shores of Papua New Guinea, at the time being a colony of Australia. And so so you can see where we're getting some of that data and why Papua New Guinea is lit up so brightly in this context. Another one that I discovered through my investigations was the Mrs. Beth Dean Carroll collection, which includes cultural items collected by this dancer, Beth Dean Carroll, throughout her travels through the Pacific and Papua New Guinea. She was a really well-known dancer who was inspired by, or now we might say appropriated, Indigenous and Pacific cultures within her practice. So these were really interesting insights and sort of tell the story of why the reach in those areas might be easily explained. But another unexpected sort of strength in terms of the visual representation was the United States, and Natalia had mentioned this when we met earlier on in the week. And that also interested me because it's not something that you might think is very obvious, but just referring back to those two collections that I've just talked about, Beth Dean Carroll was an American dancer, and so, you know, who travelled the world and took inspiration and from a lot of different nations, and so we can link that connection back to a United States story. And the Lady Helen Blackburn collection also has a US link because she married a US serviceman in America during the Second World War and lived in the United States for a really short period, while most of her story and the significance of that story and why we have her collection is because of her shell collecting in Australia. So there's some links that were kind of unexpected, but you can actually then move through those stories and find those potential impacts and influences in terms of how we might connect US audiences with some of our Australian stories. Now, was many other references to the US when I dug through the API, mostly related to relations between Australian and American political leaders in cartoons, posters and newspapers. But by and large, the reason I have decided with my I didn't dig through the whole API, that would have been almost impossible this week. The main reason why the geolocation is showing so strongly is because we use geolocation data to identify manufacture location. And so while a lot of these objects were made in the USA, their stories don't necessarily relate so strongly to what might be a meaningful engagement. So I guess, you know, some of the opportunities that I can see internally for the National Museum is really refining our data set and trying to create more meaningful data within that API to use this tool in a much more meaningful way, both for the institution and the ability to connect with audiences. And I think Kati was touching on this, but I think another potential use of this is actually to find the gaps within the collection and use it as a strategic tool for collecting. All museums have collection policies, and you know, this is one opportunity in which we could focus our attention to collecting. And just the last thing I'll say about that is something that surprised me in terms of what I might have expected based on you know, migration to Australia and the representation of our country as it is, at least for the past couple of decades, is that the top 3 countries that provide the most permanent migrants to Australia are India, China, and the United Kingdom. And while China and the United Kingdom shine brightly, India is not very strong in its visual representation, at least with this data set. And so then there's an opportunity I can see there that we could use that to think, okay, well, this collection we have, this API, is not necessarily representative of the people in this country. So I might just stop there and hopefully we can talk about some other insights, but that was my little journey this week.
Thank you very much, Craig. Valuable insight, and I'm going to get back to Natalia at the end, you know, to get her reactions to this. And now moving back to Europe, Jolan, and I've been wondering, you know, from your experience working for the Europeana, how do you think, you know, this tool could assist your work on activities, and whether you have some suggestions about additional functions that you may see valuable to be applied in your case?
Sure, thanks, Corneliu, and also from my side, Natalia, this was a really interesting presentation, and there's been some really inspiring comments on that so far. I think the way that I think Craig went through the API to then find answers of what he saw in the visualization is a really strong kind of marker of the way that we interact with these kind of geo-visualization or zoomed out views of the data that we have in our APIs. And that's something that at Europeana we're trying to do as well. So my first kind of comment I wanted to give is that these kinds of distant reading where we really have a bird's eye view of what everything is, it creates the response, I think, in people that are really interested in this content to actually start to zoom in and do close reading of what they see in the patterns that they see in this distant reading view. So this also then helps to find the biases or the gaps in the data that we have it. So that's where transparency and tools like these are really important. Craig's example of Guinea actually being Papua New Guinea, I think is a really good one, where I would hope that tools like these also allow for people that maybe don't have access to the back end of the API or the API itself to do this kind of research themselves. And once they maybe click on a certain country or a certain part of the visualization, see what the underlying data is, what the underlying rows are, so that they can actually gain insight in it themselves. Yes, when I was talking about this with a colleague of mine, Douglas McCarthy, who I think was also at a Data to Power event this Monday, he gave the example of the Cleveland Museum of Art dashboard, which I will post in chat for everyone to enjoy, which I think is a really good comparison of this distant reading versus close reading. And what the Cleveland Museum of Art dashboard does very well is it allows you to look exactly at every single piece of data and zoom in from that distant view to the close view. And I think that's one of the big powers of it. Another thing that the Cleveland Museum of Art does very well, and that this visualization also does very well and shows the power of these APIs, is connecting different APIs together. In the CMA dashboard, you can not only look at the influence or the views of a certain object on their website, but you can also look at how many Wikipedia views this object had. And that's also what this geo-visualization does with its connection to the Twitter and the YouTube APIs. I think that is really where you can show the power of connecting data through an API, is to compare data together and gain insight that you otherwise wouldn't get if you're just looking, in your own filter bubble, your own organization, your own API. So I thought that was really interesting, and I'd love to see a bit more kind of work on that, or possibilities of comparing the two. Of course, with the limitation, the caveat that was already raised of some social media APIs not being open. In the chat, there also was a really good comment about a lot of social media sharing being this idea of dark sharing, where we can't track if things are being sent over a WhatsApp message or over Signal or whatever, which is fine. That's what those apps are for. But that's also something to be aware of when you're doing this kind of research. So when it comes to the point of transparency in these APIs, that's something I was really interested in here, is the option to kind of cater your query, or cater exactly what part of the collection you're looking at when you're making this visualization. So in your demo, Natalia, you could put in a specific API query and then harvest the collection through that API. That would be really interesting to do when you're looking at even smaller collections of the API, not even looking at the full, your full organization. But if you really want to, for instance, create a new exhibition or work on a new piece of editorial, you could actually, I don't know if that's possible now, but maybe in future, plug a specific data set or a specific part of your collection into this to see, okay, where are the influences that this data set has? What are the specific countries that light up here? Why is that? Are there interesting stories behind this? And can we create some editorial to cater to that? I think that's a really nice application of this work. And just to highlight something that I think Katie also touched on, was the focus on exactly what is maybe not lighting up, but lighting up on the other side of the spectrum, the underrepresented works in our API. It's very well. There's always some surprising data that comes up when we create some editorial in Europeana that then gets a response from a country or from a certain group of people that we really didn't expect would be interested in the work we're doing. I remember we wrote a blog about sewing machines, Singer sewing machines, and there was a huge community of knitting people and embroidery and sewing people that reacted to this blog, shared it, and gave this blog a much higher engagement than what we would ever have expected of, another blog we're doing. We saw some cool Singer sewing machines in the collection, so we wrote a blog about it. And it's these kind of unexpected results that I hope we would be able to see with tools like this as well. But of course, that's I guess some more ideas for the future. I realize I've been rambling on for a lot. I have a lot more notes, but I will keep it to this, and hopefully let's open up the discussion some more later. But yeah, thank you for having me on, Corneliu.
Thank you very much, Jolan. Just to go before we go back to Natalia to hear her reaction, just to sum up, some of the key points, and I think a couple of others have been made in the chat room. So let me try to put them together. So one particular theme that seems to arise from the discussion, Kati mentioned, Jolan mentioned as well, is the idea of the relationship between, the cultural heritage and the audience. Whether to a certain extent, I think this is a very strong element of the application, but there is also concern about whether the application may overemphasizing certain themes and overlooking collections and distributions that might be relevant for the audience, but in a sense, they are not played up. So I've been wondering, one element is about, the relationship between audiences and cultural heritage, and how to make sure that, you don't emphasize the same thing all the time and actually make available more collections, to the audience. There is also the question of API, and I think there was a issue raised also in the Q&A part. And I think we know the limitations, right? I mean, not Craig already mentioned, the data needs to be sorted out, the Guinea example, but also, that not all museums, especially smaller museums, have this kind of digitalization of data available that can be connected to the application. Been wondering the context. Lev also raised the issue, which I think I found it, quite pertinent from my perspective, because at the moment the unit, and I think that's something to look in the future. The unit of analysis is the country, but from the perspective, let's say, of an embassy, bringing up, the cultural diplomacy element. From the perspective of an embassy, if they want to run a campaign in a particular city, not in the country, because it rarely happens that, how to make sense, what is relevant at the smaller unit, sub-state unit. So that's something probably an additional idea to look and to try to understand. Speaking also from my perspective on cultural diplomacy, the model from my perspective is that it provides an opportunity for discovery, what is relevant in different places, right? And how these cultural elements could be presented. I've been wondering also about the reaction from the audience, how that could be incorporated in the model, right? There is a little bit of social media in that, but I've been wondering also in terms of how the artifacts could actually be seen and who is actually reacting to them. That's something to look probably and develop a little bit more bi-directional element in this. Speaking about APIs, I think there was a suggestion for one about Wikipedia, if I heard him well, but also be wondering about sound. Spotify and soundtrack, they have, there's a lot of emphasis on podcasts nowadays. And I think there are ways in which, these elements could be maybe in a similar way as Lev presented at the beginning, of finding a way in which this kind of different podcasts talking about cultural issues and in different contexts I mentioned sound because it seems to be quite a powerful medium at the moment, podcast and so on, that tells a story. It goes into this issue of digital narrative, that also, you know, commentary, and it brings up also this element that I mentioned before about capturing better the reaction of the public to some of the issues that you. But of course, you know, prototype can incorporate as much, you know, not too many things. We have to make it feasible. But these are some of the thoughts that I think I collected from the three partners, and also my view on cultural diplomacy. So Natalia, would you like to respond to this?
Thank you so much, everybody, for such a great feedback, which I'm definitely taking on board, and will work on each and every critical comment that you shared today. There are very brilliant insights, which are great. Before I actually, you know, kind of respond to some of your queries, right? I also just wanted to mention that this panel also includes Lev Manovich, is also one of the speakers. So Lev, maybe you also can take some time to provide your feedback.
Yeah, thank you, Natalia. Yeah. Well, so, you know, I really kind of, because I wasn't sure, like, I thought maybe I had to be somewhere else, but I think it's fine. So I already kind of prematurely perhaps wrote my key idea, but it's okay. So, you know, so I'm thinking about my own experience, you know, when I started thinking how to apply data visualization and data science to cultural collections, be it Instagram images, or impressionist paintings, or I didn't have a chance to show it, but in 2013, we were given access by MoMA to our whole photo collection. I was very, very excited. And then, you know, I started doing this work and showing it, and encountered a certain kind of genre of criticism. And I first couldn't understand why. And later I understood. I mean, all human knowledge, right? Okay, maybe not good about sound, but let's say most of human knowledge, right? You know, it's situational, it's local, it's objective. You know, there is not objective, right? There is no objective proof, like, you know, which social theory, right, is better? Is capitalism better? Is communism better? I mean, we have our opinions, but, right? I mean, obviously, communism, you know, has proven itself to be, you know, killing more people than capitalism ever did, but we're still not objective. So, but, you know, when we kind of talk about things like this, with assumptions, in a way, are not so in the open. But when we start visualizing things, measuring things, creating indexes, right, suddenly we open ourselves to kind of criticism, which is not a bad thing, because we kind of have to put our assumptions or our ideas into numbers, indexes, and formulas. Right? So when Natalia talks about cultural diplomacy and what she's doing, it's fantastic, right? When I actually start looking at your index, I'm still excited, but I start wondering, right? Why your formula, you know, collects these measurements? Why you assign these weights? And of course, the same question can be asked of any index, right? I mean, social development index used by, you know, UN and UNESCO, various indexes of economic inequality, right? I mean, all these indexes are put together by usually some academics. Once in a while, we revise them, and you can always go right to you know, last page of a website which presents them and see how we calculate it, but not many people do. Once the indexes are constructed, we kind of, right, we become our own reality. So I will just simply finish by repeating what I said in our preliminary session when Natalia kind of showed right to respondents the interface. What I would like to see ideally is kind of a future interface where how index is constructed is exposed, and you can actually go and in fact you can see here's all the measurements, right? Here's all the different numbers. You can collect them into a formula. You yourself can assign different weights to these different factors. Even based on this, you will get, let's say, different visualization, and you will see, right? Because this can kind of help people to think about what is this cultural diplomacy, what is this soft power, etc., etc. Of course, it can be also dangerous because of museums or foundations or UNESCO want to use this index as an instrument of power. right? To get money, to kind of control people perceptions. If you expose how it works to people, you lose some of this ability. So the second thing, which again, I'm sorry, I already wrote it in the chat. Again, this is based on my own kind of journey, right? Working with data, big data for already like 17 years. What I realized over time is that we have big data, or we have, let's say, very fine data, right? So, but I mean, okay, we know how to do it because of security, because of privacy, but potentially you can kind of follow, right? Billions of people around the world every day, where we went, what we posted, right? You know, like I'm thinking about writing a novel where I'm going to have like every citizen of New York will be a character, right? Because let's say I can imagine, I can generate some kind of fake algorithmic data about them, right? But what we do with data, right, is we use kind of 18th and 19th century thinking, which is aggregated, right? Think about how data visualization starts in the 18th century, right? With data about economic kind of performances or exchanges of countries is aggregated. And in fact, every country is represented as one unit, which is what we're still doing today in all these different indexes. And that's also, at least at this point, right, Natalia is doing, and I know it's on the stage, right? And as I already mentioned, sorry to repeat myself, it's a good stage, but I don't know if it should be the final frontier, because obviously a country is made of cities and suburbs, right, and villages or farms or whatever. There's no such thing as friends, there's no such thing as Paris, right? It's all aggregations, it's all Platonic ideas. And then of course there are genders and educational backgrounds and social backgrounds, but perhaps a more dramatic example of how, let's say, in the next version of this interface, perhaps would be nice to see something beyond the country. Think about the kind of culture class, high culture class, right? And think about museums, but also more art biennials, art fairs. So we all know there's a particular global class of collectors who collect very expensive works, their advisors, top galleries, Gagosian, Pace, and so on, certain artists. And this is like this global tribe, right, which until COVID-19 was kind of flying around. And you know how the art fairs are being scheduled, so people can just go to Singapore, Hong Kong, etc. This global circus. And maybe it will come back or not, we don't know, but maybe if, let's say, Corona becomes a bit weaker, probably this travel will continue even more, right? So that's one example how you can basically go to the same neighborhood of a city, and there are people who like have totally different relationship, I think, right, to potentially these collections, right? Now, how do we take into account, right? Because we don't want to model every single person. I mean, there is data on collectors in the country, right? So in a way, perhaps, right? Perhaps it will be interesting. Of course, depends on Natalia funding, right? If you to at least break the country, right, into different kind of categories, or to perhaps extract some of these categories, like the kind of art mafia, and kind of break away, right, from this 18th century idea where we can treat country, right, as a single unit, or let's say early 19th century Karl Marx, right, in our kind of prototypical data scientist, right, who basically divides all the people into just two classes, right? People who have means of production, people who don't. And it already was not true in his times, and it's obviously not true now, where workers make much more money than most of us here, right? Anyway, I'm finishing my somewhat rambling, but somewhat structured remarks. So the idea is, while aggregation is a very powerful mechanism, how do we also go beyond that? And the last thing I want to say, sorry, Natalia, just one thing. I was looking at this interface of Cleveland collection, and I think another thing we have to do as museums, right? We have to resist a certain logic of global culture, which always puts in front of you most popular, most visited, right? So I go to this interface, everything is sorted by most popular works, most visited works. Well, what about this amazing little painting or engraving in the Corneliu Museum? And somebody is going to come, and this engraving is going to change this person's life, right? So how do we resist this dogmatic, taking for granted logic of the most, top 10, top 100, and so on, right? how do we can expose as equal participants things which are not popular but we actually want people to see, want them to pay attention. I'm here. So we have to resist this logic of silent majority. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lev, and thank you so much to everyone who are on the panel who provided such valuable feedback. And this is exactly what I wanted when setting up this webinar and this datathon, because the approach in my research that I'm implementing right now is open source. I need this critical feedback to develop this tool further and to address all these critical moments that currently exist. Thank you very much. Your insights are very, very helpful and valuable. Also, just a lot of comments that I received today. Let me just explain and clarify again that here is only just one layer in the data visualization, right? And it refers only to the collections. I heard a lot of comments about the audiences and engagement, but let me tell that the next layer will address all these things. In terms of, for example, mapping digital diversity, I didn't even look at the comments of audiences. I only looked at how each of the country is represented by this museum in its own social media feed, because this shows that they are interested and they activate their cultural resources to generate soft power. And social media also kind of represents, kind of tracks all the activities that are happening, because what is happening goes immediately to social media, or at least this is my assumption. Also, in terms of the level of digitalization, that, it's maps only on the country level. And I already kind of mentioned, yes, we have some limitations currently in mapping in terms of, collecting accurate and consistent data, for example, social demographic, which exists currently only on the country level. But let me tell you again that, for example, the third layer that we will present in the end of May, it will be about local engagement power, and that will present the urban level. So I think that this shows to me that there is a great interest and a great thirst in what we are doing, but you just want everything and in one thing, but I just go here step by step. And what we do here is just trying to understand how the collection represents, how the objects in the collection represents each of the country on the global map, and what is the potential, probability that audiences from this country will come and actually connect to these connections. This is only this thing that it is currently doing. So also let me thank every participant on the panel. And for example, Craig, I really loved your illuminating stories and how you really digged into different, visualization data, everything that popped up. And the Guinea example, yes, exactly. This is what we faced when we, tried to apply the collections API. We understood that some of the objects are annotated with the name of the countries that correspond to different actual countries on the, and you actually found this country that has the same name, two countries that have the same name, but located in completely different geographic, cultural, and political kind of areas on the global map. But yes, this will require another layer of polishing on both sides. First, the collections API is needed to be clean. And second, the way how we extract the data from collection API with the level of detailization, what exactly do we need to extract? It's needed to be polished. And I think this is a work on two fronts with both the collections API specialists and my IT team, who can, try to adjust all these inconsistencies, which definitely exist there. Jolan, I was very impressed by your feedback, and I think you gave a lot of interesting insights, and I now have millions of ideas how I can enhance this very narrow, very kind of focused mapping into really useful tools. I really love, for example, when I had, engaged with this visualization visualization first time and played with collection diversity, I really wanted to have that the collection diversity not only indicate the index, which shows how many objects, right, but also kind of give me details, what kind of objects. And I thought maybe it would be helpful if it instantly gives me at least 5 random objects, and I will be able to understand what are these objects from which exactly collections and what they're about. So they can already start telling stories, like going beyond mere quantification of data, right? But you gave me even further kind of idea that we can extend it even further, and in each country we can access further all the objects and provide an interface and tool to connect back to your collections or particular part of the collections to really get more insights. Because when, for example, we worked with Australian Centre for the Moving Image, so to go beyond mere quantification of data and provide some kind of thick of data, we added this, layer of digital storytelling. But for that, I had research assistants who really digged into the collection, to extract some meaningful, interesting stories, and tell the stories about each particular collections from different countries. And we added these stories, right? But now with the collections API, we actually can get instant access to this data if it's properly set up. And I think this is a really amazing idea. Thank you so much. Kati, your insights are also very, very helpful. And I enjoyed kind of listening to all your critical comments. And, one of the things that really kind of resonated about your comment that for example, audiences in China are very similar to audiences in any other countries around the world, and they might be interested not necessarily only in Chinese objects, but they might be interested in other countries, and for example, European history, cultural objects, or even Latin America and things like that. Yes, and this is exactly right. And this is so what the visualization currently on that level is doing is kind of indicating the potential reach of the collection based on the kind of collection affinity to a particular country. Yes, like you said, like audiences in any country around the world would be very much interested to look at other cultures. So before kind of developing this, I had kind of this idea, maybe we could measure this potential power reach of the collection, not on the level of cultural affinity, but also on the level of cultural exotism, right? Because people living in a particular country, because we know like exotic objects, if they travel to a country where people have a very little exposure to these particular cultures and language and object, they would be really excited. We all know about through blockbusters, exhibitions, and the results of the audience's research on that. This is not where I necessarily want to go further, because the framework that currently exists is just to show, because like I explained, objects provide these very important avenues for connections. So if you have objects in your collection from this country, this gives you another reason to reach out to the communities, to audiences, to diplomatic parties, and to establish these connections. If you do not have these objects that relate to these particular countries, then maybe the acquisition policies could be enhanced, or it's all depend on the policies of the institution and strategic development goals that they want on the global level. But anyway, very interesting insights. And thank you everyone again for this wonderful, wonderful, wonderful feedback. And I've got millions of ideas how I will enhance all that. And I'm ready to develop like even better tool with all this feedback. I think it's only half an hour left right now, and I think it's important to move further. And now we need to go to our final part of our discussion. Which is the discussion forum. We have a few more participants who have joined us for the forum, and I'm happy to introduce to you Seb Chan, Chief Experience Officer at ACMI, Morgan Strong, Digital Transformation Manager, and Dave Patten, the Head of the New Media at the Science Museum Group. So the discussion forum will be facilitated by Dr. Laura Popoviciu. She's an experienced London-based art historian and a researcher as well as the curator at the UK Government Art Collection and the Department of Culture, Media and Sport. And before Laura starts the discussion, let me invite you again to submit your evaluations via Mentimeter. If you have interesting examples to share to illustrate your answers, please submit them via chat, and it would be great to learn from your insights. And now I give the floor to Laura.
Thank you very much, Natalia. Hello, everybody. I feel very inspired, and I've learned a lot from all the presentations and comments so far. And before addressing the questions from our audience members, I would like to ask our new panelists, Seb, Morgan and Dave, to elaborate a little bit on their own museum collections API, their current use, and to bring up any interesting projects created around APIs by or with external stakeholders. So perhaps Seb, if you'd like to start.
Sure, no worries. I'm just going to share my screen just so it's a bit easier. I'll just quickly jump through a couple of things. So hopefully you're seeing an image. I'm speaking from a kind of Wurundjeri country in Naarm, also known as Melbourne. And so I'm speaking from also the National Museum of Screened Culture. What's interesting about our collection and quite different to the previous collections and the APIs that I've worked on or my teams have built at the Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian and also at the Powerhouse in Sydney over the past decade is everything we have is under copyright, which creates a lot of issues for what can actually be done with a public API. We actually released our metadata, our collection metadata in 2016, and this was prior to an API being made available. And this created a lot of really interesting outcomes. And I think I've learned over the past decade and a half, I guess, that sometimes an API is not the best way of releasing your collection data if it is going to be used in the broadest possible way. So our MIT students made a bunch of data visualizations that actually began to change the institution's collection strategy and policy. So here's one that was looking at films about craft and visual arts makers, and it was pointing out that most of them that were in our collection focused on male creators, and that actually has spurred us to collect more documentaries by and also about female creators. Similarly, visualizations of experimental film, these are sort of segments of our collection. In 2021, of course, we reopened the museum, all redeveloped, and that data dump now auto kind of generates. And the API that's publicly available also runs the galleries. So the museum uses its API to build all its products and services, including this one, which I'll just show about a 30-second video of. So this is an experience that's at the end of the gallery. It's called the Constellation. So what's interesting about that is it's actually connecting the collection we have to many things in the world that we do not have to tell particular stories. So The API went public in November, and this basically allows people to create their own applications, including people who make interactive experiences for our galleries in the kind of future. And importantly, the API allows people to do this without asking us specific permission. And what we do is we enhance our data sets from our collection data. We enhance it also with other things because we don't have images and we don't have video. So being a museum of film, TV and video games, we actually, where possible, link to the movie database and other data sets that do have images and do have, say, things kind of like trailers as well. But we also released a couple of simple experiments. One of them was a Wikidata matching tool, which allows people to explore connections in Wikidata from works and people within our collection, but also this, which takes the descriptions that our curators and collection staff have written and then runs it through VQGAN and CLIP. So this is taking the short descriptive text about Mad Max, and it's auto kind of generating using VQGAN an image of what a computer thinks those words might express. Similarly, a very recent commissioned work. Again, we don't have an image of that work, but again, running that metadata through VQGAN, we get these imaginary images of the collection. So what we're trying to explore here is also and encourage people to think of museum collections and museum data sets as things that aren't meant necessarily to be representational, but actually imaginative, and to allow people to create imaginary things from it, and for these things to become the beginnings of rather than the end of a search. People who want to search, we will use our collection search, and researchers will use that anyway. So the API publicly is really there for people to play around with and make fun experimental things with, and that's the Earl. I'll pop it in the chat. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Seb, and absolutely fascinating insight into how to experiment and the potential of using collections in such a wonderful way. Thank you. Morgan, if you'd like to tell us about your experience and your collections API, please.
Sure. Okay, so first of all, I'm presenting from Bjola and Bjola country in northern New South Wales, which is not actually near where my gallery is, which is up in Turrbal and Jaguar country, but COVID means daycare's closed, so I'm hundreds of kilometres away from where the collection is for daycare. But I'm in a different part of my collection API journey in that I'm overseeing a program to digitize our collection and also modernize some of our infrastructure. So we've recently done an interim release on our collection online, and it's got a bit of API functionality, but what I'm really building towards is trying to make something a little bit better than that and learning from a lot of my mistakes in the past. So for example, what comes out of a collection system is not necessarily that interesting to a lot of people. So we really need to look at augmenting that with some more data, which Seb did some brilliant examples of. And I can really relate to Seb on the copyright front. I'm from a museum and archive background, so coming to an art gallery, a modern art gallery, where almost everything is under copyright, because that's where our collection focus is. You have to think very differently about what that data is, and just releasing a whole bunch of JSON blobs to the public doesn't really add a lot. So I am thinking more about our users, and I will talk about one of the biggest mistakes I made 10 years ago and why that's leading to where the focus on building it now is, which is if you make it easier for our internal teams to use, we'll incorporate our collections much more heavily into our on-gallery experiences. So what we build inside our multimedia interactives is really quite impressive, but you know, hitting like even something basic as the collection data is currently configured, is it on display or not? You can't easily answer that question. So I'm kind of taking the raw feed out, putting it into a middleware application that can augment that and simplify the structures and put that into something that's a little bit easier to query, so we can actually incorporate our collections internally more. and then also invite other parties into collaborating in that space. So that's kind of where I'm heading with that. But kind of why I'm focusing more on trying to bring in content partners and make it easier for internal users as the first step. I'll obviously put all the data out and put the collection online, of course, but it was about 10 years ago. I remember when I was at the museum I was at, I really was excited about our new collection API that we put out there. And I had the really bad attitude of thinking, I can't wait to see what people do with our data. And realizing that no one's that interested in the data. You need to find the interested parties that are going to be interested in what you're doing. And in Australia, there may be similar events overseas. There's this event called GovHack, where they invite a lot of young developers to come in and just mix up government open data sets to build applications and so on. So I came armed with my new collection API. This is about 2010, 2011. And spoke to every single group and said, I've got this data, this data, this data, and none of them were interested in any of it. And it really illustrated to me that you are looking for partners, you are looking for people who really can derive a lot more value out of it and making it easy for them to use. So this time around, I'm building it with all of that in mind. Mindful of time, I will now cross back over to you, Laura.
Thank you very much, Morgan. And it's definitely so important to learn from experiences and challenges from the past, and to in order to perfect what you're doing. So thank you for sharing that. And Dave, would you like to share your thoughts and also bring up some of the projects and digital projects you've worked on, and how the users have experienced these projects?
Yeah, thank you, Laura. I feel like a complete fraud in this conversation because I'm not really about APIs, but I do manage some of the work where we're using some of those APIs. So it's probably worth giving just a quick bit of context. I'm from Science Museum Group. We have a collection of just over 400,000 objects and about 500,000 archival records as well. Of those 400,000 objects that are digitized, about 100,000 of just over 100,000 have photographs. And we built out an API for that in 2017, partly to help with the redevelopment of the website, but also to open up some other opportunities for using that data, both internally, but also to encourage external people to use that data. Since the API has been available, we've run a number of hackathons to explore different ways we might use that data. So we ran a hackathon very early on, once we made that API public, partly to do some testing around how effective the API was and how easy it was to use, but also to look at the kinds of things that we might do, particularly public facing things that we might want to do in the museum or potentially through mobile apps. And we developed a range of things at that hackathon, including some really interesting games and some really interesting visualizations. It was a 2-day hackathon. At the end of that 2 days, we opened all of those experiments up to the general public to come and see them, which was a kind of really interesting thing to do. And it meant that we got to get those demonstrated in front of quite large numbers of visitors at the end of the second day. We also ran a hackathon that was looking at ways of exploring and exposing the collection. And I think this really kind of talks to some of the points that Kati was making, that we really run the risk of showing people less and less of our collection as we kind of rank and score this. And we're really interested in how do you get visitors to look at some of the less well explored parts of the collection. So we did some work around that. And I think Helen Jones a bit earlier put a link into the chat window about one of the projects that we built, which is basically a Chrome extension that lets you see an object from our collection that nobody else has seen before. And we've done some other kind of Chrome extensions, including Museum and a tab, where basically every time you refresh a Chrome window, you see a different object from the museum's collection, which is quite fun and can be quite addictive once you start looking at that. And also looking at things like what happens when you send the museum objects through to visual recognition system, so the Amazon recognition system and Google recognition system, and looking at the tagging data that comes back from those systems and whether that is kind of would be useful tagging information to include as part of museum records. And one of the things we found, certainly looking at the image recognition, is the amount of bias within the image recognition systems. It's pretty easy to work out what the image recognition systems have been trained to do. So yeah, Amazon image recognition system absolutely is, it thinks everything is a product. It's kind of looking for things that would help sell that to you, which can be really interesting when you send a museum collection in its direction. We're also doing some academic research projects, and Kati is part of both, or V&A are part of both of these. So we've just finished a small project called Heritage Collector, which looked at basically applying existing tools to what are often thin cataloguing records and other data sources, and trying to bring new meaning to those. And I'll post a link in at the end of this to the Science Museum's digital lab blog, where there are kind of links to articles on these projects. And we've just started a much bigger project, which is part of a UK funding bid called Towards a National Collection, called Congruence Engine, which is a 27-month research project with multiple partners, where we're looking at what happens when you combine lots of disparate collections, digital collections, and what new knowledge might you gain and new inferences might you gain, and how do you build the digital tools that allow you to explore those opportunities. So for instance, the museum has a collection of textile machines. We're working with various museums and university collections, looking at other records associated with the textiles industry, things, people that have records of sales and import data, that have records of social housing and workers, organizations that have records of sample materials that were produced on those textile machines, and what happens when you start to bring all of those things together, and what does that allow you to do that those collections on their own don't allow. And I think that's going to be a really interesting project. It has just started at the end of November last year, and we're just kind of beginning to run into the first set of bigger workshops around that project. So I think that will certainly be something that's worth looking at. And I think probably lastly from me, I'm working on a project with Niantic, using their newly released API, which was developed originally for Pokemon Go, which is a kind of geolocative based API, looking at putting the science that the museum holds back into the real world. And this is not really about objects, it's about the concepts and the buildings in the real world and making association with science. And we've been using a little bit of doing some work with the API, really to kind of focus the direction that's going. We won't draw on the API in a live way for that project, but it's been helpful as we've been thinking about how we're going to explore different elements of the real world through a scientific lens. And I think that's probably, I should probably leave it there because we're going to run out of time.
Thank you so
Laura.
much. Thank you very much, Dave, for sharing insights into all these wonderful projects that you mentioned. And of course, one crucial element in developing these projects is user testing experience. And Kati, I'd like you to elaborate on this and on your experience with user testing, how important it is to use this and to reach out to users to test the friendliness and the possibility of engaging with these projects and visualizations.
No problem. So we recently revamped what was called Search the Collections, which was the original digital product that served up all the V&A's collections online. And it was very much a silo where it had lots of rich data. And as its name suggested, it was brilliant if you knew exactly what to type in a search box. But lots of our audiences don't necessarily know what they're looking for, but they're really interested in the stories of art, design and performance. And so we wanted to create an experience that catered not just for those in research mode who know exactly what to put in the box, but for those who just want to explore. And so we did a lot of research, a big quantitative survey of 8,000 users of our collections online, as well as some much deeper qualitative work that was much more sort of ethnographic in its nature, that really dug into not just the behaviours of those who currently engage, but also crucially those who don't currently engage with collections online. As Seb pointed out in the chat, you know, not everyone is interested in collections data, but we know lots of people are interested in the broader stories around those collections. And so it really fueled what was a sort of mission, a hunch of ours, that it was really crucial to start bringing together the editorial stories about those collections with the collections data into one experience. And we packaged that up as Explore the Collections. And that's really built on the insights that we developed through our user research, which identified 4 different modes of engagement. And we think that's a much more interesting view in onto behavior, not to think about segments that are much more demographic in their basis, but thinking much more in terms of behavioral modes that people exist in. And people can move within different modes in one session or between different days and weeks and months. And so we developed a number of features, and I think there's been some allusion to this in the chat, and some of the work that Dave's been doing in terms of how images are classified, etc., having a much more image-led approach to the presentation of our collections data, and creating new features, for example, something like You May Also Like, which is like a visual smorgasbord, which allows people just to see related objects that look like the objects that they're currently viewing, and takes them on a much more horizontal exploration around our collections. And I think that's really crucial around how we create design journeys based on those behaviors to take people to see objects that they weren't necessarily intending to see, but that relate visually and in data terms to the objects they've landed on. And so we've seen dwell times go up, we've seen much more engagement with images, we've seen much more editorial consumption of content, and that's all based on the insights of taking a much more user-centered approach to how we design our digital products and services. That's a summary. I'm really mindful of time, but I can expand if needs be.
Thank you very much, Kati, and a really interesting point about behavior and your approach. And I've got one last question for Craig and Jolan, and this is from our audience members. Is it possible to apply this type of visualization to other fields other than collections and visual arts, perhaps to bring in interdisciplinary? And have you had experience with other types of data in terms of visualization? Craig?
I might have to throw to Jolan on this one, because I have definitely not had much experience in that space, and the museum is definitely not at that point yet, and we're still engaging with very simple visualizations. So yeah, I might pass.
What about interdisciplinarity? Is this something that you'd like to pursue in the future?
Absolutely. Look, yeah, I think the possibilities are endless, and the more complex those stories you know, within the visualizations become, the more, you know, we can tap into those diverse audiences that we really want to tap into, and those audiences that don't already engage with the more obvious stuff. So yeah, absolutely.
Thank you, Craig. And Jolan?
Sure, yeah, there's not that much that I can add, but I think a few examples actually have already been given. Dave was talking about, you know, collaborations that are really a bit more commercial or maybe more tourist oriented. These kind of visualizations or these explorations into the data can really help, you know, people engage with the built world, with the built environment. I think the collaboration with Niantic is a really interesting one to really, instead of having people, you know, the typical art experience of going into a museum or going to an online exhibition and seeing, you know, what is there, you can actually engage with your surroundings, and that really creates an interdisciplinary kind of collaboration between, for instance, the tourist industry and the art industry. So I think that is something that we're looking at a lot as well. There's a lot of opportunity within education for this. So we have a whole part of my team at Europeana is looking at how can we kind of leverage these kinds of explorations into data into the education fields to let people understand data on different kinds of levels, to let them think more critically about what these collections are, where they come from, what they can do with it. And I think a last thing that I think that is really important that we really need to work on is to have these visualizations used as a way to decolonize or create a post-colonial collection. The patterns that we see, and this has already been highlighted in these talks, of course, kind of show the structural inequalities, the historical, dominances or oppression even that has happened, and is still visible in these collections to this day. So what I'm really interested in is exploring this to create editorial or to involve people to tell these stories of underrepresented communities, of oppressed communities. That's something that we're really working on at Europeana, is to look at our data and, for instance, see if there are any really interesting narratives in there that we as a collections engagement team cannot tell ourselves. So a very recent example is we have a lot of content of the Sami people, which are an indigenous people in the Scandinavia area of Europe. We don't have any people with Sami lived experience or people of the Sami community in Europeana, which really is a pity, but we'd really love to tell those stories anyway. So these kinds of looking into this data can really help us work on either hiring cultural consultants or working on repatriation efforts or creating editorial that shows these stories in a different light than we as the curators at Europeana can give.
Thank you very much, Jolan. And thank you to all of you for such an engaging discussion. And thank you to the audience members for the questions. And I'll hand over to Natalia now for closing remarks.
Thank you, Laura, for facilitating this panel, and thank you each of the panelists for sharing more details about how you use your collections API and what are interesting projects emerge around this metadata of the collections. This is really insightful and gives more inspiration. So I just wanted to close. We have maybe 3 minutes left only, and to show you the results of the evaluation that we conducted with our audiences. And I must say that we had only 15 people responded to their survey, and as I can see from the results, the majority of them assessed so far the collection reach power layer in quite favorable terms on all these different levels. So, for example, the interface of the profile setting is user-friendly and convenient to indicate URLs to the institutional data repository. So, and yeah, we have several this kind of criteria about their usability, friendliness of the interface, our indices that we use, and how the whole visualization helps to actually find zones of interest and to dig deeper to identify interesting stories behind all this visualization. And I must say that those who rated, they have very, very favorable feedback for this, but I think the better quality kind of response that I received, it was through all the discussions that we had today with all the panelists and all the participants, because these details are so valuable, and definitely I'm going to address each and every of these comments. So yes, Corneliu, do you have a few words to close up the meeting before I invite everybody to our next event?
We had a very good discussion today, and I think it prepares well the next event that we plan to have in March and May. I mean, just a couple of points that I've been main lessons. I mean, for me, again, using my cultural diplomacy hat in this conversation, I think what I learned is that most of the museums are now fully embarked on very serious proactive digital strategies of making the collections digital and making them available. What I think the issue is how to make this collection visible and to what kind of audiences, the larger spectrum and wider spectrum of audiences. I think there is a a concern that might be a risk of silo thinking, in the sense that we popularize, certain type of thing that we feel very proud of it. But I think, there's Dave mentioned that, and Morgan also mentioned, and Katie as well, that you need to reach out to different partners to see what seems to be the interest, and to develop networks. And finally, I think what is missing also, and probably we can think in the next events, is how this also can be made relevant from a cultural diplomacy for embassies, for Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I have noted down a few ideas that can have transpired from this conversation. I think there's a tremendous potential to strengthen this collaboration. I think on a digital level, between embassies and and museums and GLAM institutions in general. So we're looking forward to our next events, which will, I think Natalia is going to announce relatively soon, by the end of February or so, mid-February or so. Thank you all for your insight and participation.
Thank you, Corneliu, for the final remarks, and thank you once again to all participants today. It was a great pleasure to share my research findings and developments with you, and I'm also happy to say that this online session is only a start in our open source research project that prioritizes the professional museum community input and invites various stakeholders to co-design the new mapping prototype with us. In our online event session in the end of March, not February, in the end of March, we will present the new layer of the mapping solution devoted to the exploration of digital audiences. Please come back in spring, and in the end of May, we will be mapping on the urban level with urban data and their impacts, local impacts of different programs, traveling exhibitions, and projects happening in different parts of the world. So thank you so much, and come back.